all reveal that while somewhat flattened out, the divine assembly descended from the older Canaanite divine royal family was still pretty intact by the period of the composition of some of the Hebrew Bible. Further, this period also saw Yahweh ruling with his consort Asherah, though Anat, remember the other daughter of El, although it's not clear who her mother was, Anat, the most metal of all goddesses of the ancient world, she seems to have functioned with Yahweh at the Elephantine shrine there on Elephantine Island in Egypt. We have Yahu Anat mentioned there, so she seems to have perhaps been a kind of daughter consort, although exactly what that relationship was down there at the Yahweh shrine on Elephantine Island is not clear. For at least the Yahweh partisans, what seems to have emerged is something of a compressed henotheism. There are other gods, but our God is the best. Remember that my dad can beat up your dad. To something like monolatry, we were only going to worship our group God. Thus a kind of henotheism to monolatry spectrum, though with some tension as to kind of what to do with Asherah. It appears that her devotion was very strong and quite widespread. I mean, mother fertility goddesses are going to be extremely popular for obvious reasons, if for nothing else, given the infant mortality rate of this time. It also appears that the eventual demotion and eventual elimination of Asherah was quite a very slow process. Perhaps the monolatrous factions, by focusing more on exclusive worship of Yahweh, diminished her position, ultimately producing a kind of theological divorce. Of course, her devotion continued, but this theological divorce would then allow her to be targeted for official state suppression, such as at public shrines, especially the Yahweh shrine in Jerusalem. This tendency toward monolatry also compressed into fewer and fewer divine and semi-divine beings, a compression aiding, even if unconsciously, on the trajectory toward eventual monotheism centuries later. So one motor here, if you want to think about it that way, is an alternating force of mythological compression, the divine family is just getting smaller, and suppression, elements of it are being attacked and picked off one by one. More on this kind of religious suppression, especially state-backed suppression, in a moment. However, another development in the theological landscape of the ancient world, especially in the 8th century, is also worth mentioning here. Most deities at this time were conceived of as regional, even literally dwelling in some sense in shrines specific to those regions. They were literally the houses of those gods, and they were specific to that locale. This was their turf, so to speak. It's like the Crips and the Bloods, but it's Yahweh and Baal. While these various manifestations in various regions, deities were largely taken to be regional in character, even if specific to certain shrines in those cities. So Baal Hadad and Baal Bethel might be just manifestations of Baal in those areas. However, with the great empire building of especially the Assyrians, an interesting theological shift begins to occur. While previous theologies, again, usually had regional deities fighting alongside or on behalf of their warring kings, these often local skirmishes over lands contested as belonging to that king or god. It appears that the Assyrians, however, boasting of one of the first truly professional armies in the history of the world, and using it with great brutality to create a vast empire, understood themselves as creating a unified imperial system whose central state god, especially Ashur, but to some degree Ashur assimilated with Babylonian Marduk, was increasingly conceived as a universal divine being ruling over all the lands conquered by the Assyrian army. This Assyrian royal theology of one universal imperial king and one universal imperial god, thus not only Ashur fighting alongside the Assyrian kings, but ruling over vast lands never initially associated with Assyrian royalty or their divine geographical mandate. This shift in Assyrian royal theology seems to have made a huge impression on everyone around them, because the Assyrian boot was on their neck, and that makes an impression upon you. Of course, the Israelites are going to be upon those for whom an impression is made. The first is that the northern Israelite kingdom would just be destroyed by the Assyrians by 722 BCE. ending state Yahwism there and prompting a massive refugee crisis, with the southern kingdom of Judah eventually itself becoming an Assyrian vassal. Israelite royal theology, as witnessed by numerous psalms, had long seen a special relationship between the king, as typified by King David, and the Israelite national god Yahweh, whose throne home was Mount Zion, within the temple in Jerusalem. Now, a lot of this royal theology did draw on more archaic Canaanite mythology, but also on Yahweh's own history as a kind of warrior raiding deity. Yahweh as an Ish HaMilchama, a man of war. These psalms develop an elaborate cosmic terrestrial parallelism where the terrestrial ambitions of the earthly king are mirrored in the cosmic combat led by Yahweh. It's typical of the ancient world. Here, kings set out against their enemies, while Yahweh is enjoined by cosmic angelic armies, or by semi-divine beings like the war and plague hypostases Dever and Resheph in Habakkuk. These are survivals, by the way, of the more archaic four-tier divine council period, with Resheph being part of that divine council way back in Ugaritic times. This king-god parallelism even becomes mythologically conflated when the divine will rise up the king to set his hand upon the sea and his right hand upon the river. The king literally taking on a titanic scale himself, battling with the primal forces of watery chaos, the Mediterranean and the Tigris and Euphrates. Indeed, these mythological exaggerations for the once and future Israelite king, they become the foundation for later messianic hopes and aspirations. This is rhetorical strategy made into theology, evolving into theology. It's very similar to the mechanisms that are going to ultimately produce monotheism. But with the imperial theological innovations of the Assyrians with their universalizing god Ashur, the Israelites could continue to expand the mythological power of their god. That path had been blazed by the Assyrians. The Assyrian theologians perhaps first conceived of a universal god, still a god again among other gods, but a real badass god, but now free of regional or shrine parochialism. However, it wouldn't be a powerful empire that would make good on that universality. It would be a kingdom sitting in the ashes of exile that would effectuate monotheism, it seems.